Most stories about spiritual awakening end too early. They end at the moment of realization, at the breakthrough, at the light. They tell you what it feels like when everything opens, when perception sharpens, when meaning floods in, when life suddenly feels guided, intimate, and alive with purpose. They describe the beauty, the relief, the sense of finally understanding, and then they stop, as if the story has reached its natural conclusion. But for many people, that is not where the real story begins. What happens after the awakening fades is rarely discussed, not because it is unimportant, but because it is unsettling, difficult to romanticize, and resistant to simple explanations. It does not fit neatly into spiritual narratives. It does not feel sacred. It feels quiet, awkward, exposed. This is the phase when the visions stop, but life does not become easier, when insight remains, but certainty disappears, when you are no longer asleep, but also no longer held. And this is where many people begin to feel afraid. Not the dramatic fear of darkness or collapse, but a subtler fear. What if this is it? What if the awakening didn't lead somewhere higher, but somewhere more ordinary and more demanding? What if the universe is no longer guiding you, testing you, or watching you, and you are left alone with your choices? This story is not about enlightenment. It is about what comes after. It is about the silence that follows the light. The return of the shadow you thought you had outgrown. The collapse of the spiritual identity that once gave you meaning. The moment when meaning itself stops arriving, and finally, the unsettling freedom of living without a witness. These are not failures of awakening. They are its consequences. If you are in this phase, you may feel disoriented, disappointed, or quietly panicked. You may wonder whether something went wrong, whether you lost something essential, or whether you were never truly awake at all. This narrative does not offer reassurance in the usual sense. It offers something rarer: recognition. Because the end of spiritual awakening is not the end of depth. It is the end of illusion. And what remains, raw, unguarded, and frightening, is the responsibility of living without guarantees. This is the part no one warned you about. When your spiritual awakening ends, it doesn't announce itself. There is no closing ceremony, no final vision, no voice congratulating you for having made it. What arrives instead is silence. Not the peaceful, meditative silence people romanticize, but a hollow one. Thick, unfamiliar, and strangely alert. It feels as if something that once filled the room has quietly stepped outside and closed the door behind it, leaving you alone with the echo of your own breathing. At first, this silence feels like relief. The intensity is gone. The constant emotional surges, the heightened sensitivity, the sense that every moment carries a hidden message. The colors are still there, but they no longer shimmer with meaning. Songs sound like songs again, not transmissions. People speak, and their words stay on the surface instead of piercing straight through your chest. This is usually the moment people think something has gone wrong. During the awakening, everything felt charged. Pain felt purposeful. Confusion felt sacred. Even fear had a strange beauty to it, because it seemed to be guiding you somewhere. Now that charge is gone, and without it, ordinary life feels disturbingly flat. You might catch yourself thinking, was it all just my imagination? Did I lose something important? The fear doesn't come as panic. It comes as doubt, slow and corrosive. What no one warns you about is that the end of awakening feels less like an ending and more like abandonment. You were not just experiencing insights. You were in a relationship with meaning itself. Every coincidence felt personal. Every struggle felt orchestrated. And now that relationship appears to have ended without explanation. The universe no longer flirts back. You ask silent questions and receive no immediate answers. The signs you once relied on stop appearing, as if the world has collectively agreed to stop whispering in your ear. This is where the first unsettling realization creeps in. You are no longer being carried. During the awakening, many people unconsciously surrender responsibility, not in an obvious way, but subtly. Decisions feel guided. Intuition feels loud and trustworthy. Even mistakes feel meant to happen. When the awakening ends, that guidance fades. There is no cosmic nudge telling you which path to take. There is just you, your values, and the consequences of action or inaction. For some, this feels like falling back into the body after floating for too long. You become aware of hunger, fatigue, boredom. Time slows down. Days no longer collapse into symbolic moments. They stretch out, unremarkable and demanding to be lived minute by minute. This return to linear time can feel oppressive, almost cruel, especially after tasting something that felt timeless. The fear deepens when you realize something else. The old version of you is gone. You cannot fully go back to who you were before the awakening. The illusions you saw through do not magically rebuild themselves. You still see the patterns in people, the unconscious behavior, but now, instead of feeling like a compassionate observer, you feel exposed, like someone who knows too much and yet has no clear place to put that knowledge. This is where isolation often begins. Friends might notice you've changed, but not in a way they can name. You are calmer, maybe quieter, but also less impressed by things that once mattered. Small talk feels heavier. Ambition feels oddly artificial. At the same time, you no longer feel above any of it. The awakening stripped away not only illusions, but also the comforting identity of being someone who is becoming enlightened. And that loss is rarely acknowledged. There is a subtle grief in realizing that the phase which made everything feel meaningful is over. Not because meaning is gone forever, but because it is no longer delivered to you in bright, undeniable flashes. Meaning now has to be built, chosen, embodied. And that responsibility can feel terrifying. This is the first part no one warns you about. The awakening does not end with clarity. It ends with uncertainty. A quieter, more dangerous kind. One that does not shake you awake, but asks whether you are willing to stay awake without constant reassurance. As the silence settles in, a question begins to form beneath everything else, slow and unavoidable. If the universe is no longer guiding me step by step, who am I supposed to be now? After the silence settles in, something else follows. Not immediately and not dramatically. It arrives quietly, the way fog rolls in when you're no longer paying attention to the horizon. This is the return of the shadow, the parts of you that seemed to dissolve during the awakening, now re-emerging with unfamiliar strength. During the awakening, many people believe they have transcended their darkness. Old fears soften, trauma feels lighter, habits loosen their grip. You may have felt as though you finally rose above jealousy, anger, insecurity, or the need for external validation. For a while, that feels true. The light is so bright that the shadow has nowhere to stand. But when the awakening ends, the light stops doing the work for you. This is where the shock begins. Old thoughts return, sometimes sharper than before. An unexpected wave of envy, a sudden craving for approval, a flash of anger that feels embarrassingly human. And the most disturbing part is not their return. It's the realization that they never actually left. Many people panic here. They assume the awakening was fake, or that they've fallen back spiritually. They try to recreate the old state. More meditation, more rituals, more spiritual content, more attempts to feel elevated again. But the harder they chase the light, the heavier the shadow feels. What no one warns you about is this. The end of awakening is not a failure. It is the moment integration begins. And integration is far more uncomfortable than awakening. During the awakening, insight comes effortlessly. Truth feels obvious. Compassion feels natural. But integration demands something else entirely: honesty without transcendence. You are no longer floating above your flaws. You are standing face to face with them, fully awake, with no spiritual bypass to escape through. The shadow now demands to be seen, not dissolved. This can feel cruel. You thought you had outgrown certain wounds, only to discover they were waiting patiently beneath the surface. Childhood patterns reappear in adult situations. Relationship triggers feel more intense because you can see them forming in real time, yet still feel powerless to stop the emotional reaction. Awareness without control becomes its own kind of torment. And then you might think, I know better than this. Why am I still reacting this way? Awareness, once a gift, starts to feel like a spotlight exposing every imperfection. You can no longer pretend ignorance, but you also cannot instantly transform. This gap between knowing and being creates a quiet, persistent discomfort. Some people describe this phase as feeling split. One part of you sees the pattern clearly, another part is still living it. And instead of merging, they seem to argue constantly. The mind watches the self stumble, narrating every misstep with brutal clarity. This is where many people become deeply disillusioned with spirituality. The promise was freedom, peace, alignment. But what you are experiencing feels messier, heavier, and more raw than before. The practices that once soothed you now feel empty or mechanical. Affirmations sound hollow. Spiritual language feels inadequate to describe the complexity of what's happening inside you. And yet, something important has changed. The shadow is no longer unconscious. Before the awakening, your fears and wounds ran the show from behind the scenes. Now, they stand in the open. They don't control you invisibly anymore. They challenge you directly. This is not regression. It is exposure. And exposure feels threatening because it removes excuses. You can no longer say, I didn't know why I reacted that way. You can no longer say, that's just how I am. Responsibility has quietly returned, but in a deeper form than before. This is the second part no one warns you about. After the awakening ends, the shadow doesn't disappear. It asks to be integrated. Not healed in a dramatic breakthrough, not erased through insight, but slowly understood through repeated uncomfortable encounters in ordinary life. And ordinary life is where this work happens. In conversations that trigger you, in relationships that mirror your wounds, in moments where you choose comfort over growth, even while knowing the cost. There is no cosmic drama here, no visions, no signs, just you, standing at the edge of your own patterns, realizing that awareness alone does not save you. It invites you into responsibility. By the end of this phase, another unsettling truth begins to surface. The awakening showed you the light, but what comes after demands that you learn how to live with both light and shadow, without escaping into either. There comes a moment after the awakening ends when you realize that it didn't just change how you see the world, it quietly changed how you see yourself. And now, that version of you is dissolving. During the awakening, an identity often forms without you noticing. You may not have labeled it, but it was there. The one who sees, the one who is awake, the one who understands. This identity feels subtle, even humble, yet it carries a quiet sense of separation. You are not better than others, you tell yourself, but you are different, more aware, less asleep. When the awakening fades, this identity begins to crack. You notice that you react emotionally just like everyone else. You get impatient, you feel insecure, you make choices that contradict your insights, and slowly, painfully, the image of yourself as someone who has figured it out starts to collapse. This collapse can feel more disturbing than the loss of mystical experiences because it threatens your sense of meaning. If you are no longer the awakened one, then who are you? This is where fear deepens, not as panic, but as existential unease. The spiritual identity once gave coherence to your struggles. Pain meant growth. Confusion meant transformation. Even suffering felt justified because it placed you on a path. Without that framework, discomfort feels raw and purposeless again. Many people unconsciously try to defend this identity. They double down on spiritual language. They subtly position themselves as observers rather than participants in life. They analyze emotions instead of feeling them. They correct others internally. They cling to the memory of what the awakening felt like, using it as proof that they are still there, even when their lived experience says otherwise. But this defense creates a strange tension. On one hand, you know the identity is fragile. On the other, letting it go feels like erasing the most meaningful chapter of your life. The awakening may have been brief, but it restructured your internal world. Losing its identity feels like losing proof that it mattered. What no one warns you about is this: spiritual identity can become a new ego, quieter, more refined, but still deeply attached. And when it starts to dissolve, it fights back. You may feel irritation toward people who are openly unconscious, even though compassion once came easily. You may feel resentment toward normal life for pulling you back into routines and responsibilities. You may feel an unspoken superiority mixed with guilt for feeling it at all. These contradictions create inner friction that is hard to name. The most unsettling part is realizing that the awakening didn't remove the ego. It simply reorganized it. Now, instead of being attached to success, status, or approval, the ego may be attached to insight, depth, or awareness. And when life humbles you, through failure, emotional reactions, or ordinary confusion, it doesn't just hurt your pride, it threatens the story you told yourself about who you are. This is often when disillusionment peaks. You might think, if awakening doesn't make me different, what was the point? Or worse, if I'm still struggling, maybe it was never real. But this is the misunderstanding at the center of the fear. The awakening was never meant to give you a permanent identity. It was meant to take identities away. What follows, however, is something far more frightening than feeling special, becoming ordinary again, without illusions. Not the unconscious ordinary of before, but a stripped-down humanity. You still feel fear, desire, attachment, and confusion, but now you see them clearly, without romantic framing. There is no story to hide behind, no elevated self-image to protect you from discomfort. This can feel like a kind of death. The spiritual self you quietly relied on no longer holds. And in its absence, you are left with something unfamiliar. A self that is not defined by awakening or sleep, insight or ignorance, but by choice, action, and accountability in everyday life. This is the third part no one warns you about. The end of awakening dismantles the identity it created. And without that identity, you are forced to meet yourself without labels, roles, or spiritual achievements to lean on. By the end of this chapter, a sobering realization begins to settle in. Awakening was never about becoming someone new. It was about removing the story that you needed to be someone special at all. One of the most unsettling changes after the spiritual awakening ends is not emotional, it is existential. Meaning, which once seemed woven into every moment, quietly withdraws. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough for you to notice its absence. And once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. During the awakening, meaning felt automatic. Events lined up with internal states. Conversations mirrored inner questions. Even suffering felt symbolic, as if life itself were speaking directly to you. Nothing was random. Everything pointed somewhere. This created a deep sense of trust, not necessarily in happiness, but in coherence. When that coherence dissolves, the world begins to feel disturbingly neutral. Things happen, and they simply happen. A relationship ends without revelation. A mistake occurs without a lesson neatly attached to it. A bad day is just a bad day. The universe no longer seems invested in narrating your growth, and that absence feels personal, even if it isn't. This is where a quiet fear takes root. What if there is no message anymore? Without constant meaning, your inner compass feels unreliable. You may catch yourself searching for signs out of habit, patterns in numbers, phrases that repeat, coincidences that once felt electric, but now they fall flat. The magic doesn't land. The interpretation feels forced, like reading symbolism into static. And this is deeply destabilizing. Meaning once softened uncertainty, it made pain tolerable and confusion sacred. Without it, life feels exposed, raw cause and effect, action and consequence with no guarantee of narrative closure. For many, this is the moment when existential anxiety surfaces more strongly than ever before. Because if meaning doesn't arrive on its own, you have to create it. And creation is risk. When meaning was given, you could trust the process. When meaning must be chosen, you can no longer hide behind destiny or divine timing. Your decisions carry weight again, not because they are right or wrong, but because they shape a life that will not be explained away by cosmic intention. This responsibility can feel terrifying. You might feel an urge to retreat, into distraction, into old habits, into spiritual nostalgia. You may binge content that reminds you of the awakening, hoping to feel that sense of significance again. But repetition without presence only sharpens the absence. The more you chase meaning, the more artificial it feels. And then comes the most disturbing thought of all. What if life has no inherent meaning at all? This thought often arrives not as despair, but as a quiet, logical possibility. And because you are now more aware than before, you cannot easily dismiss it. You see how humans construct narratives to survive. You see how beliefs soothe fear. You see how purpose can be a psychological anchor rather than a cosmic truth. This awareness can feel like standing at the edge of a void, not an emotional one, but an interpretive one. Nothing collapses, nothing explodes. The world continues exactly as it is. But the invisible structure that once made it feel purposeful is gone. What no one warns you about is that this phase can feel more frightening than chaos. Chaos at least feels alive. Emptiness feels indifferent. Yet, this is also the threshold of something rarely discussed. When meaning stops arriving, presence becomes the only thing left. Not presence as a spiritual concept, but presence as an unavoidable fact. You are here, breathing, choosing, acting, feeling, without an overarching story to justify it. Life becomes immediate again, not symbolic, not instructional, but real. This forces a subtle shift. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" you begin to ask, "What am I going to do with this?" And that question does not point upward. It points inward and forward. This is the fourth part no one warns you about. After the awakening ends, meaning no longer arrives to rescue you from uncertainty. You are asked to live without guarantees, without cosmic reassurance, without the comfort of being part of a clearly defined journey. Perhaps meaning was never something to be found. Perhaps it was something that appeared only when you stopped trying to escape the responsibility of living. And that realization does not feel enlightening. It feels sobering, grounding, irreversible. And that realization, for many, is far more terrifying than darkness. The final and most disturbing shift after a spiritual awakening ends is subtle enough that many people never name it, yet powerful enough to reshape how they exist in the world. At some point, often without a clear trigger, you realize that you are no longer being watched. During the awakening, there is often a sense of an inner witness, something observing your thoughts, emotions, and actions with quiet intimacy. Whether you interpreted it as higher consciousness, the universe, God, or simple awareness, it felt present. Your inner life felt held. Even in solitude, you were not alone. When the awakening fades, that presence recedes, not completely and not in a way you can point to. But the feeling of being inwardly accompanied weakens. You still have thoughts. You still reflect. But the sense of being seen by something larger, wiser, or more stable diminishes. And what remains is a form of solitude that feels deeper than physical aloneness. This can be profoundly unsettling. Because when no one is watching, not even the universe, a question arises that cannot be spiritualized away. Why be honest? Why be kind? Why choose integrity when no cosmic mirror seems to reflect it back? This is where fear takes its final form, not as dread, but as moral exposure. During the awakening, ethical choices often feel aligned with a larger order. Doing the right thing feels supported, reinforced by intuition and inner clarity. Without that reinforcement, goodness no longer feels guided. It feels chosen. And choice, when stripped of divine supervision, is heavy. You may notice this in small moments. You could lie and nothing would immediately collapse. You could take the easier path and feel no inner punishment. You could act selfishly and the world would continue turning. And that realization is terrifying. Not because it invites darkness, but because it reveals freedom without supervision. What no one warns you about is that the end of awakening removes the feeling of being witnessed. And without a witness, your actions no longer echo back with immediate meaning. They simply become facts in time. This can feel like a loss of safety, as if the moral structure of reality itself has gone quiet. Yet this is also where something rare becomes possible. When no one is watching, integrity becomes real, not symbolic, not rewarded, not observed, real. Kindness without audience, honesty without validation, responsibility without spiritual credit. This is the moment where spirituality ends and adulthood begins. You are no longer performing goodness for the universe. You are no longer aligning with a cosmic flow that assures you of your place in a greater story. You are simply a human being, capable of harm and care, acting in a world that does not guarantee justice or recognition. This can feel unbearably lonely at first. The loss of the witness strips away comfort. It forces you to confront the fact that much of what felt sacred was also supportive, a scaffold that made life feel held. Without it, the ground feels harder, colder, more real. But slowly, something shifts. You begin to notice that actions still matter, even if they are not recorded. That honesty still shapes you, even if no insight follows. That love still leaves traces, even if it dissolves quietly. Meaning does not announce itself, but it accumulates in the texture of your life. This is the final part no one warns you about. After the awakening ends, you are left alone with your freedom. No signs, no witnesses, no guarantees. Just the ongoing, irreversible fact that you are here, and what you choose to do with that fact becomes your life. And in that stark simplicity, something unexpected emerges. Not enlightenment, not transcendence, but a grounded, unromantic dignity. The awakening did not fail. It withdrew, so that you could learn how to live without being watched.